Hi, I'm Ashton. I use he, they pronouns, and today I want to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is disability justice. If you are familiar with my corners of the internet, you are probably at least by name familiar with disability justice, but I wanted to talk about it a bit more in depth. Like many of my other longer, more scripted, more structured videos, this one has chapters, so it's going to be relatively structured. I'm going to start off by talking about kind of the background, like my qualifications, the context. Then I'm going to talk a bit more about the disability rights movement and kind of what came before disability justice. I'm then going to give a basic overview of disability justice as a framework. Then I'm going to talk a bit more about the differences between disability justice and disability rights as frameworks and movements. Then I'm going to talk about some big ideas within disability justice. Then I'm going to talk about goals in disability justice futurism. And then I'm going to talk about getting involved in kind of my action items. I don't know if there's a better way to phrase that, but the chapter timestamps will be in the description and hopefully along the little bottom bar, assuming that I managed to do that correctly. And you may feel free to use those as you wish. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but I have spent quite a bit of time researching and scripting it and playing around with it and trying to make it work. And let's get started with the context, I guess. If you are unfamiliar with me as a person and like the way that I don't know, navigate the world and identify myself, I do consider myself disabled. I'm autistic, which it's complicated in terms of diagnosis, as it is for many autistic people. I'm not going to talk about my personal experiences with diagnosis today in terms of autism. I'm autistic and I've known that for about 5 years, maybe 6 years, I don't know. I also have EDS, HEDS specifically, which stands for hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I have suspected that I had that for 3 or 4 years, and it was confirmed by a medical professional a few months ago. So while I am relatively new in terms of being like medically validated as disabled, I have considered myself disabled in terms of being autistic for quite some time. Regardless, I am disabled. Whether or not you believe that is not in my hands, but it is a term that I identify with and use and find helpful in explaining and categorizing how I experience the world. I guess I just wanted to clear that up right off the bat because I am not someone who is typically visibly disabled. I'm sometimes noticeably disabled because I don't mask my autism all the time, and I do sometimes wear braces for my EDS. I just wanted that to be clear so that it doesn't seem like I'm a non-disabled person being like, I'm going to tell you about disability justice, because I don't know, I tend to believe that the best people to learn about frameworks and social justice movement terminology and ideas about are the people that directly experience them. I would hope that's a relatively commonly held belief, but maybe it's not. I don't know. My other qualifications, I guess, include that I took a disability studies course within this past year. I've been involved in real life and online disabled circles for years. So this is something that impacts me and that I talk about, and it's not something that I just like decided to make a video about on a whim, you know? I'm not saying that I'm like a professional or someone who cannot be challenged, because I don't ever want that to be the case. If you think I deserve to be challenged, then please challenge me. Really, my goal for this video is I just want to talk about something that I think more disabled people need to understand, and disabled people in general would benefit from understanding, as well as non-disabled people. This video is not only meant for disabled folks or people who identify as disabled. I know that a lot of the people in my audience specifically are radical politically in one way or another, usually in more ways than one, and I wanted to introduce this in a way that makes sense to my audience as I understand you, if that makes sense. DJ is something that is, or at least should be, interlaced with every other branch of radical advocacy and direct action, and that's at least the way that I understand it, and I hope by making this video I will help you also understand it that way. Long story short, I feel like my audience includes a lot of people that would benefit from hearing about and discussing disability justice and understanding more about what it is and where it comes from. I mention DJ a lot in person and online, but online, one of the more frequent responses that I get is, what is that? So this is my what is that video. I also want to be very clear that I am not an authority on disability justice. I did not invent it. It is not my idea. A part of what makes DJ so liberatory, to me at least, is that it is kind of like a big group project, and it does value a lot of different people's diverse opinions, voices, experiences, and that's what makes it so adaptable and so valuable in terms of being a framework that we can look at the world through. So that's one of the things that I enjoy it for, and I don't want to misrepresent it as something that I know a lot about and you don't. So I hope that's clear. I hope that makes sense. Last point for the background intro section is that, of course, per usual, all of the sources that I have consulted will be listed in the description. They're going to be linked in order of use and broken down by chapter. All right, chapter 2, contextualizing disability justice within the disability rights movement. It felt, I don't know, unwise to make a video about DJ without at least giving a little bit of context. Just like practically every other marginalized group, disabled people have always existed, even before recorded history. There are decades upon decades of history of disability and disabled advocacy, and there's no way that I could possibly cover more than a sliver of it in a small section of a video like this. Additionally, because the way that history is recorded, taught, and disseminated, it is inevitably greatly influenced by the Eurocentrist ideas in white supremacy that also underlie ableism, and therefore most of what I know about and what is published about disability, in English at least, focuses on the US and UK. I initially planned to attempt a at least overview of disabled advocacy in general, but there is simply no way to condense like hundreds of years of worldwide history into a section of a YouTube video. I kept trying to do it and I was like, this is simply so long and I have so much more to talk about, and it just wasn't gonna happen. I had big dreams, but sometimes you have to be more realistic than that. However, I am still going to link multiple sources for this chapter that I found interesting and useful in considering a broader, wider history of disability advocacy outside of the US and UK, and I would definitely encourage you to look into them if you are interested. Regardless, I wanted to give a little bit of context on the disability rights movement so that we all at least have a little bit of knowledge going into this broader discussion. I do worry that providing a brief overview of the United States' disability rights movement will cast it as monolithic, so I do first want to explicitly note that it certainly was not. The very brief summary that I'm giving you is just for context, and I cannot pretend that it even begins to represent the vast, long-lasting, and far-reaching movement that disability rights was and is. If you don't know much about the disability rights movement, please do not take this as your own education on it. There are many sources in the description in a variety of formats that I would encourage you to check out, and of course do not take me as the authority and do not take my sources that I have found as the end-all be-all. With all those disclaimers out of the way, in the States at least, the disability rights movement has largely been focused on passing laws and regulations aimed at helping disabled people. Disability rights work picked up speed in the 60s and 70s. There are tactics from the 1977 sit-ins at various government buildings that got Section 504 passed to the Capitol crawl in 1990 tend to be based in protest and direct action. Disability rights leaders often cite previous anti-racist work, especially that of the Black Panthers, as inspiration for the methods that they used in terms of organizing. And if you didn't know, the Black Panthers actually helped with the Section 504 sit-ins in 1977, which is a very cool fact. A lot of disability rights activists also worked directly with the government on both small and larger scales. The Americans with Disabilities Act, broadly known as the ADA, passed in 1990, and it's often discussed as and upheld as like the pinnacle achievement of the disability rights movement. And DR has accomplished a lot in terms of legal change for disabled people, but there still are a lot of things that folks that would consider themselves in a DR framework fight for, including expanded healthcare and insurance access, as well as equal marriage for disabled people, which is still something that does not exist in the United States. So that is just my super brief, quick summary. If you don't know much about disability rights, there are over a dozen sources in the description for you to learn more about different parts of the history of disability and the activism surrounding it. I've got sources on the disability rights movement, but also about psychiatric institutionalization and disability in Indigenous Latin Americans. I've linked some stuff from the Disability Museum. I've linked some stuff from Mad in America, multiple really good blog posts. So with the background of disability rights as some context, let's talk about the beginnings of disability justice. Disability justice as a framework and a movement and an idea was developed by disabled queers and people of color in 2005, so 15 years after the ADA was passed, as a framework that could kind of go beyond what the disability rights framework could, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the next chapter. The conversations that birthed the idea of disability justice began with Patty Byrne and Mia Mingus, and later included Leroy Moore, Stacey Milburn, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. You'll notice me reference Sin's Invalid a lot through this video, as well as a lot in the description, and that is because it was founded alongside the idea of disability justice, and it hosts a lot of really, really important resources on the topic. and it is led by some of those people that I just mentioned. In one post, disability justice is described by Patty Byrne and Sins Invalid as a vision and a practice of what is yet to be, a map that we create with our ancestors and great-grandchildren onward, in the width and depth of our multiplicities and histories, a movement towards a world in which every body and every mind is known as beautiful. Sins Invalid also has a really great resource on the 10 principles of disability justice, which is a really good way of understanding what it is in terms of a framework. And of course, I will link that down below. I would definitely recommend reading it. These are the 10 principles as listed by Sins Invalid and kind of explained by me. The first one is intersectionality. A DJ approach must appreciate, recognize, and integrate the struggles of all oppressed people, the ways that they overlap and intersect to create unique experiences of oppression and unique experiences of privilege. A nuanced understanding of intersectionality has to be incorporated into disability justice work in order to recognize that pretty much everyone has some areas of their own life and identity in which they are oppressed and others in which they are privileged. The second principle is leadership of those most impacted. Disability justice work has to center multiply marginalized disabled people. Rather than centering the voices of academics or experts, disability justice aims to center those that are the most impacted by the systems that we fight against. The third principle is an anti-capitalist politic. When land and humans are valued only for the profit that they can produce, as they are under capitalism, having a disabled or non-conforming body mind is anti-capitalist by nature, especially when we do not place normal or good levels of productivity as a goal. A disability justice framework believes that human worth should never be considered dependent on what we produce, how we produce it, or how much we produce. Disability justice cannot be achieved under capitalism. The fourth principle is a commitment to cross-movement organizing. DJs should aim to impact how adjacent social justice movements understand disability and contextualize ableism within their movements. And we should value the connections and solidarity between disability justice and other liberation-oriented movements. In their piece about the 10 principles, Sins Invalid specifically mentions DJ's alignment with racial justice, reproductive justice, queer and trans liberation, prison and police abolition, environmental justice, deaf activism, and fat liberation, and that's only a beginning. The fifth principle is recognizing wholeness. We should understand people as having inherent worth, individual histories, and unique life experiences. The sixth principle is sustainability. I really love the phrasing that Sins Invalid uses for this one, so I'm just gonna directly quote them here. We value the teachings of our bodies and experiences and use them as a critical guide and reference point to help us move away from urgency and into a deep, slow, transformative, unstoppable wave of justice and liberation. Disability justice can't happen if everyone is pushing themselves into burnout all the time. Yes, DJ has to be something that we are committed to, but we also have to be committed to taking care of ourselves and each other. The next principle is a commitment to cross-disability solidarity. DJ is for physically disabled people, it is for sick and chronically ill people, it is for deaf people, it is for blind people, it is for neurodivergent people, it is for survivors of the psychiatric system, it is for mentally ill people, it is for people with environmental injuries, chemical sensitivities, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, all of it. Barriers between these subsets of disability and the historical exclusion of many types of disabled people from disabled advocacy only further isolates us from one another. The eighth principle of disability justice is one of my favorites, interdependence. Interdependence as a principle posits that we should work towards meeting one another's needs without relying on state-based solutions, as those necessarily extend state control, which opposes the goal of liberation for people and land. The ninth principle is collective access. A disability justice-oriented understanding of access lets us understand that access needs are not shameful and they are not static, and access needs can be met in a variety of ways. It also encourages us to recognize that both autonomy and vulnerability can coexist and should both be respected. The 10th and final and kind of overarching principle of disability justice is collective liberation. Revolution cannot be achieved when anyone is left behind. It is also definitely worth noting here that the simple addition of the word justice to anything disability related does not on its own make something disability justice. If a quote-unquote disability justice service, event, or community does not center principles like anti-capitalism or interdependence, using the phrase is just hollow. The beginning of a Sins Invalid blog post from 2020 phrases it this way: "We've witnessed people add the word justice onto everything disability related. This is done without a significant shift in process or goals, as if adding the word justice brings work into alignment with disability justice. It doesn't." Claiming an event or a community or a space as something that is disability justice oriented without doing the very important but also sometimes difficult and complicated work of unlearning a bunch of biases we have about disability, of understanding interdependence, of rejecting capitalism and eugenic logic. Not everything that calls itself disability justice is disability justice. When something becomes kind of a buzzword, when you hear it a lot, You kind of have to be careful of how it's used, and disability justice in some ways has fallen into that. That does not mean that disability justice is bad. It just means that you need to be careful in terms of spaces that align themselves with the phrase, because it doesn't always mean what it should. Disability justice is not an idea that aligns itself with the Democratic Party. It's not a framework that is liberal. It is a radical framework, and if it is not executed and if it is not understood through that radical lens, through that anti-capitalist lens, then it is not disability justice. And saying that is not gatekeeping disability justice. It is saying that disability justice means something. It is a framework that has been articulated by queer disabled people and by disabled people of color, and it is not a framework that should be taken out of an anti-capitalist context. It is not a framework that should be removed from its radical roots. And that is something that I very strongly stand by. I do want to dive a bit deeper into how the framework of disability justice applies to some big topics in the sphere of disability. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about the differences between disability rights and disability justice as both methods of analysis and as movements. And here we come upon chapter 4, disability rights versus disability justice. Not versus in that like they're fighting, just like versus like, imagine I'm creating a T-chart in my brain of like, disability justice is on one side and disability rights is on the other side, and we're like comparing and contrasting. DJ can kind of be understood as the radical child of the disability rights movement. DJ can appreciate the things that came out of the DR movement while also recognizing that the DR movement doesn't, in many cases, go far enough, and that there are a lot of points in terms of the theory, in terms of the praxis, where disability rights can be improved upon. It might be helpful for some people to conceptualize it similarly to how other social justice movements diverge. You can think about white feminism versus intersectional abolitionist trans feminism and black feminism. Think about the assimilationist gay rights movement versus the more radical and anti-assimilationist queer liberation ideas. Another maybe helpful conceptualization is thinking of disability justice as addressing the cliffhangers that disability rights left off. There's no like defined or official set of differences between DR and DJ, but I came up with 4 that I see as core differences, things that I find different in the analyses of disability rights and disability justice. Again, I'm not an authority on this. These are just my observations about some of the core schisms between the movements that I find helpful in conceptualizing the differences between the two. And the first one is the importance and centrality of rights. As you may assume from its name, a disability rights approach inevitably centers rights as a method of getting what we want. Disability justice as a framework, on the other hand, is critical of the idea of rights as something that is an end-all be-all in terms of equality. An anti-capitalist and anti-colonial critique would argue that liberation cannot be achieved by state-awarded rights that at their best sometimes enable some disabled people to access some equality. Any rights-based framework, whether it's disability rights or gay rights, inevitably centers people that can access legal action and people that are more appealing to the legal system. You have to have a relative amount of money, power, time, and privilege to successfully sue for discrimination. So while the ADA may be helpful for people who can sue for discrimination, it's not necessarily going to solve all of the disability community's problems, because rights can't solve everything. They just can't. None of this critique either is to say that there aren't valuable conversations about rights and what they mean happening in disability rights spaces. And disability justice isn't saying those conversations about rights or how we should achieve them are invaluable. It's just saying we need to think deeper than that. Additionally, disability justice is aligned with the abolitionist movement. Reliance on state solutions can't be understood as the panacea that disability rights approaches sometimes imply it to be. Especially with the knowledge that laws, borders, and state control have been actively hostile to disabled people throughout history and today, it is hard for a lot of more radical disabled people to imagine that the state, which has furthered things like the ugly laws, sterilization, institutionalization, and incarceration, etc., is the same entity that can get us out of this ableist mess. People in disability justice circles tend to question the legitimacy of the state rather than turn to it for band-aid solutions when it is the same institution that has historically marginalized us. This schism between disability rights and disability justice is very reminiscent of a point of contention that a lot of radical queers have with the idea of marriage equality, if you're familiar. And if you're not, that is a story for another day. But as a whole, kind of to summarize, disability rights oftentimes frames legal rights as the end-all goal of disability advocacy, whereas disability justice reminds us that any solution that relies on the state cannot and will not save us. The next core difference that I want to touch on is disability as a single issue or single item. Obviously, right, the disability rights movement centered on disability, but that's kind of where it started and stopped. There's relatively little examination of adjacent marginalized identities, which was alienating for a lot of disabled people who do experience being multiply marginalized. A lot of the big names within disability rights are white people, and the vast majority are men. On this topic, I really just wanted to highlight a quote from Mia Minkus's blog that really spoke to me. Of course, again, the source will be linked, and I would highly recommend reading her blog. But Minkus wrote, "As a queer disabled woman of color, disability justice feels like a political home for me, a place where I can engage in conversations about disability and race and gender and queerness and capitalism and more. I tried to look to the disability rights movement, but I saw very few leaders who reflected me, and I found that for the most part, disability was being talked about as an isolated single issue. Having been involved with racial justice, queer liberation, reproductive justice, and feminist movements most of my life, I have rarely encountered spaces that address disability or connected it with other issues." But that is what disability justice as a framework does. That's the point of it. It's to connect all of these ideas together because that's important, and disability justice recognizes that that's important, and that's like one of the central goals, right? Another core difference is the idea of independence versus the idea of interdependence. The disability rights movement, as well as advocacy that happened before the disability rights movement, focused a lot on independence and its value and its necessity, I guess. You may have heard about independent living centers, for instance, which were born out of the disability rights and independent living movements. The push for independent living in terms of independent living centers or the independent living movement has been really important in terms of disability history because it allows for far more autonomy for disabled people, and it is also a material move away from carceral institutions. And it has created a lot of important resources for a lot of disabled people. DJ doesn't necessarily say that independence as an idea is bad, just that it's underanalyzed as something that we should position as a core goal of human life. DJ says instead that it is better for all of us if we refuse to rely on an ideal that is rooted in individualism, as independence is. But put a pin in this one, we will talk about interdependence more a bit later. For now, I just wanted to highlight that this difference exists. We will delve a bit more into interdependence in, 5-10 minutes. The last kind of central difference that I pulled out between disability rights and disability justice is the centering of mobility impairments. Historically, both within the disability rights movement and before it, disability advocacy has kind of been sectioned off based on what, for lack of a better word, subtype of disability you have. There are advocacy circles for deaf people, blind people, invisibly disabled people, people with mobility impairments, autistic people, etc. This is certainly useful in some cases, and I am not by any means saying that we should completely integrate and never talk to people who are disabled in the same way that we are, because it can definitely be helpful to talk to people with super similar experiences to you. At the same time, there is a problem if the movement, whose title is disability rights, only focuses on the needs of one genre of disabled people. And that is why disability justice has such a strong emphasis on cross-disability solidarity. If we are trying to understand and break down ableism, where it comes from and how it impacts all of us, we need more than only the input of people with mobility impairments. We also need autistic people, invisibly disabled people, blind people, deaf people, all sorts of people, right? So with those differences between the frameworks in mind, let's move on to some three big ideas within the sphere of disability and the way that disability justice can help us understand them. Also, just a heads up, this section of the video is going to be relatively theory heavy in comparison to the rest of this video, so if you don't want to engage with that, that's fine, use the chapters feature, but I'm going to try to make it as accessibly worded as possible because that is the point of this video. When you start thinking about disability on any level other than the surface, you have to wrestle with, how do we conceptualize it? What is it? How do you categorize someone as disabled? How should we as a society address and treat it? There have been a lot of ways of doing just that over time, and the way that it's been done can A, help us understand more about how thought surrounding disability has evolved, and B, give us new ways of conceptualizing our own body minds and their relationships to the world. In disability studies, these ways of approaching disability are called models, and I'm going to run through a brief overview of some of the most prominent ones in order of chronological appearance and discuss how they relate to disability rights and disability justice as frameworks. The first model that has been kind of theorized and discussed in the Eurocentric world is the charity model, when large churches treated and aided disabled people if they were deemed worthy of alms and charity. Think about the Salvation Army, think about missionary trips. There are a lot of ways that the charity model still pervades a lot of disability happenings today, but it is largely something that anyone knowledgeable about disability has outgrown, more or less, hopefully. After the charity model, you get the medical or individual model, which is a model that understands disabilities as a problem that should be solved, an issue that should be resolved, something that should be treated and cured. So if someone is disabled, say I'm autistic, wild example, I know, the charity model might say, oh, if you're disabled enough, or if you like God enough, maybe we'll give you a bed in the poorhouse. Whereas the medical or individual model may say, oh, you're autistic, you should go to ABA therapy so that you can act not autistic, so that everyone else can be more comfortable with you. Because even if you are autistic and we haven't figured out how to cure it yet, I'm so sorry. You should definitely act like everyone else and not like an autistic person. When disability activism was gaining steam, a lot of disabled people were like, the medical model, the individual model, kind of sucks, huh? So they came up with the social model. The social model emerged from the political arguments of the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, which formed in the 1970s and was a relatively small group of disabled Marxists that advocated against liberal and reformist disability campaigns. The social model, according to UPIAS, defines disability as the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organization which takes little or no account of people who have physical impairments and thus excludes them from participation in the mainstream of social activities. And there's a few things that I may need to explain further in order for this model to make sense. So the social model says that impairment is something individual and private, and that is distinguished from disability as something that is structural and public. The social model believes that we should accept impairments and remove disability. So we should accept the things that make us individually different, whereas we should remove the structural public impairments that prevent disabled people from living a fulfilling life. The social model in this case understands disability as a cultural and historical phenomenon akin to gender, rather than something that is a universal and unchanging essence. So the medical model treats disability as an individual deficit, reducing the complex problems of disabled people to those of medical prevention, cure, or rehabilitation. The social model, by contrast, asks for removal of barriers, anti-discrimination legislation, independent living, etc. And the social model does have a lot of strengths. It is simple, it is memorable, and it is effective. It is a relatively easy model to understand when it comes to the complex sociological ways that we consider identity, and it has been effective politically in building the disabled social movement. Additionally, something that has been useful in the proliferation of the social model is that it can be signaled through the language that we use. When you hear someone say disabled people, that generally signals a social model approach, whereas people with disabilities signals a more mainstream medical approach. The social model is also something that is instrumentally effective. It's practical. It identifies social barriers as something that needs to be removed, which is like an actionable item that can translate into more accessible public works, buildings, services, etc. It is also a model that is psychologically effective in improving the self-concept of disabled people and building a positive sense of collective identity. If you believe your whole life that your disability is a personal failure or a medical problem, that kind of sucks, but when you're introduced to the social model and you understand that you are also a valuable person and you deserve access to society, that's something that can be really psychologically helpful for disabled people. That's probably not surprising. However, the social model also has pretty significant weaknesses. Perhaps the most notable is its authorship by a small group of white, physically disabled heterosexual men that by its nature excluded a lot of people. It also neglects impairment as an important aspect of a lot of disabled people's lives. Experiencing degenerative conditions, chronic pain, chronic discomfort can make it a lot harder to regard disability as something that is entirely socially constructed. Additionally, the UPAIS social model's harsh distinction between impairment as a medical idea and disability as a social idea kind of fails when it's difficult to parse apart, because it is the interaction between individual bodies and social environments that produces disability. They aren't two completely separate ideas that never overlap. So within disability rights advocacy, the social model is pretty widely used in order to improve the self-concept of disabled people, as well as provide actionable items like changing social barriers. And, for good reason, it does have its pros. And clearly the social model was a massive departure from the medical model and the charity model, but it still leaves a lot to be desired, and that's one of the things that disability justice kind of picks up on. So as you may have guessed, disability justice doesn't stop at the social model. Why would we, after all, be satisfied with a model created by a bunch of straight white men 50 years ago? As far as I'm aware, disability justice doesn't have a singular model that helps us think about disability in the way that disability rights has the social model. But I kind of like that about DJ as a whole. There is no prescriptive way in which everyone within DJ views disability. As a framework, disability justice emphasizes understanding our situation as disabled people as complex, as nuanced, as something that is not static. So there doesn't necessarily have to be one way in which we all conceptualize disability. Because disability justice aims for cross-disability solidarity and centers the experiences of those most impacted by various oppressive forces, it's able to incorporate the ideas of multiple models beyond the social model in order to further understand in more complex ways what disability is and how it shapes us. So let's talk about a couple of the models that exist beyond the social model, because that's not the end of it. There is also the minority model. Disabled people have been considered a minority in a variety of ways for a while, but the concept of the minority model specifically in terms of how we conceptualize disability came from academics in the 80s and 90s. Theorizing disability as a minority identity is helpful in some ways. For example, it was really useful in solidifying disability studies as a legitimate academic field. However, there are also a lot of very valid concerns regarding the minority model. The minority model theory often wrongly presumes the compartmentalization of identity, and it doesn't really leave ample room for the examination of intersections between disability and various other forms of identity. As a whole, the minority model never really gained much ground outside of academia, and especially not as much ground as the social model. And as much as I'd love to talk about it a bit more, this video is pretty long, and of course, if you want to learn more about the minority model, there will be a couple links in the description. Next, I want to talk about the theory of complex embodiment. This is not really a model of disability in the way that the social model, minority model, charity model are, but it is very intricately connected, and the next models that we are going to talk about kind of fall under the theory of complex embodiment, so I wanted to talk about it first. Complex embodiment is an idea that was introduced to disability studies from feminist studies by way of Tobin Siebers. In a nutshell, the theory of complex embodiment states that knowledge is situated within social locations. It's something that is embodied. It's something that is understood through unique individual experiences that are impacted by socioeconomic historical factors. And the consequence of that is that we can claim that people in marginal social positions have an epistemological privilege when it comes to theorizing the way that their identity is situated within social settings. When you are in a marginal social position, you can understand that marginal social position in a way that people in the dominant social location cannot. That's what complex embodiment is, more or less. The theory of complex embodiment recognizes that many lived experiences are impacted by disabling environments, but it also emphasizes factors affecting disability, such as chronic pain, aging, secondary health effects, etc., that are derived from the body. So unlike the social model, which kind of separates the personal impairment from the social disability, the complex embodiment model tells us that both happen intertwined. They aren't something that can be extrapolated from each other because they overlap in so many different ways, and we can experience both of them and we can talk about both of them, but we shouldn't necessarily try to parse them apart when they are so deeply intertwined. Complex embodiment says that bodily factors like aging, secondary health effects, etc. are not less significant than disabilities caused by a disabling environment, whereas the social model does kind of imply this. Instead, bodily factors of disability should be understood as belonging to the spectrum of human variation that is deeply intertwined with the forces that impact disability. So the crucial thing to understand here is that the medical individual model and the charity model view relationships between the social and the embodied as non-existent. The social model presents the relationship between social representations and the body as unidirectional. However, complex embodiment views that relationship as reciprocal, as bilateral. In Tobin Siebers' essay that introduces complex embodiment to disability theory, which again will be linked down below, Siebers talks about wanting more models of disability, wanting models that fit in this complex embodiment framework, in this idea that yes, our bodies can be important, while the social barriers that prevent us from interacting with society are also important. Multiple things can be true. Why can't we acknowledge that multiple things can be true? And one of the responses to that I personally really like is Alison Kafer's political relational model. So this comes from Alison Kafer's 2014, I think, book Feminist Square Crip. Kafer's political relational model is theorized as building off of the social model and the minority model through a queer feminist lens by articulating multiple complexities of disability. So the political relational model, obviously we've got the political, right? We should understand disability as a way of being, as an identity, as a label that is inherently political and deserves a place in radical politics and social movements. And we've got the relational. Disability doesn't exist in vacuum. It exists in relation to able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, and disability is experienced meaningfully in and through relationships as well. For example, the social lives of disabled people may shrink when they become disabled. Friends and family of disabled people often also encounter lateral ableism, etc. Disability is related to multiple things in multiple ways, and a lot of those things are multidirectional. Kafer's political relational model also notes that disability is not a problem that is located within one's body-mind, but instead in the environments and socio-political patterns that marginalize certain kinds of body-minds. This is a similar outlook to the social model, except Kafer notes that both the idea of impairment and disability are social ideas, and therefore cannot be clearly parsed from one another. Also notably, the political relational model neither opposes or valorizes medical intervention, but instead recognizes that it is possible for disabled people to simultaneously desire a cure for chronic pain, for instance, while also identifying and allying themselves with disabled politics and disabled folks, which is something that I think is a very cool and important part of a framework that is definitely notable. So while none of these models are the model that underlies disability justice, I think they can still all be useful in understanding how we conceptualize disability. And I really enjoy that disability justice generally allows space for all of them through the recognition that no two people have identical experiences, but each person's experiences still bring something to the table. And all of this whole section about models of disability is really just to say that doing some metacognition about disability, thinking about how we think of disability, can be really useful in understanding how we conceptualize ourselves in relation to the world and in relation to other disabled people. If you've never thought about the models of disability before, that might have been a lot for you to take in, but again, there will be recommended reading down below, and I think it is definitely something worth exploring if it is something that interests you. That was a long section to start off this section with, but next we're going to talk about interdependence. So remember when we put a pin in the idea of independence and interdependence? Take that pin out, we're talking about that now. So independence as a pillar of the disability rights movement is something that a lot of disabled folks today find somewhat problematic for a variety of reasons. First, it is not possible for every disabled person to live quote-unquote independently, and centering independence as a goal or something that is really valuable excludes those that can't reach that goal. Instead, we should question why independence is something that is valued in the first place. We should also consider that everyone is dependent on someone in one way or another. Practically everyone relies on farmers, agriculture workers, grocery store workers, etc. And it is really valuable, I think, to recognize that we all depend on each other. There's no such thing as someone that is truly independent in today's day and age. I think it is also definitely worth thinking about the way that contemporary American culture at least valorizes independence in a very insidious and backwards way. The people considered the pinnacle of independence, right, in our culture are the upper class, right? People that don't need government handouts and don't rely on their community food distros and are financially independent. That's kind of what America as a culture is trained to look up to in terms of independence, at least, right? But that notion of independence, that value, that ideal of independence is something that is incredibly individualistic and incredibly embroiled in capitalism. When you think about it for any longer than a minute, that genre of independent person is actually really reliant on the work of others. The upper class hire cleaners for their homes, they dine out, they hire a cook, they have a nanny, or they pay for childcare in some other way. The list goes on, right? Everyone depends on someone, and that is not a weakness, that is an integral part of human nature, and it is not something that we need to shy away from. Why would we uphold so-called independence as the pinnacle of a good or successful life when it is far more honest, far more sustainable to recognize and appreciate the ways that we rely on each other? Recognition and appreciation of interdependence, the complex and various ways that we do rely on each other, allows for cross-movement solidarity. It recognizes our own limits and appreciates the work that we do for each other. And it's a far kinder and more realistic and honest worldview that allows much more space for fostering community in a way that isn't at the expense of disabled people who cannot achieve independence, or at the expense of a myriad of service workers that are oftentimes swept under the rug and ignored when we talk about upper-class independence. So interdependence, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of people within the disability justice sphere, is something that is just a more honest way of viewing the world, and something that we should value instead of independence, something that we should kind of think about as a goal, think about as a method of caring for each other, as opposed to relying on capitalist and individualistic ideas of independence that are not really real to begin with. Finally, for this section, I want to talk about accessibility. So let's start with like a thought experiment, an exercise of sorts. What do you think about when you think of accessibility? Maybe ramps, elevators, sign language translation, closed captioning. Maybe you think about tactile pavement or accessible bathrooms, or digital accessibility features like higher or lower contrast web pages, readable fonts, text that's screen reader friendly, etc. Disability justice, with its commitment to cross-disability solidarity as well as liberation for everyone, encourages us to go a bit further than that. All the things that I've already mentioned are important, yes, and they do need to be more universal, but that's not the end of it. To kind of illustrate this, I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay that I wrote about masking that I'm considering turning into a video. Access as an idea is far more complex than superficial ADA compliance. Especially within a disability justice framework, access can be construed as a socio-political goal. Access needs differ wildly between people and may even clash, but we can imagine and create access for each other as an act of love and interdependence. Access is sign language translation, wider toilet stalls, and assistive technology, but it is also stimming without shame, changing plans last minute because of a chronic pain flare, sharing painkillers or antihistamines when someone runs out, and wearing a mask. Access goes beyond architecture and technology. It is a commitment to love and interdependent care. It stretches beyond considering the needs of disabled people to also interrogate access needs for many groups that are faced with constraints of movement and expression: children, migrants, women, and queer people for starters. In a pandemic that disproportionately impacts poor people, people of color, women, and especially those multiply marginalized, masking is crucial to consider both as social justice praxis and as a material act of solidarity. Considering access in a more complex and disability justice-oriented way is something that can open up a lot of really good socio-political goals, in my opinion. It allows us to think about accessibility on a far more deep and intimate level than legal compliance or best practices guidelines do. It allows for mistakes and encourages growth. We know that perfect accessibility is next to impossible. A mountain and a wetland are not going to be accessible to everyone, and not everything has to be accessible to everyone all the time because it's impossible. We can't be that perfect, and that's okay. What's important isn't everything being perfect on paper or following the ADA. What's important is working together to meet all the needs that we can, dealing with contradictory access needs in innovative ways, and caring for each other and making sure that we can all access the spaces that we need to. It is also the broadest and therefore, in my opinion, the most beneficial definition of access. If access is not just about disability, but also about language needs, rethinking societal norms, unlearning cis heteronormativity, making the world accessible to disabled people and all types of disabled people, including migrants, women, queers, kids, etc., we can discuss and enact accessibility as an increasingly important and widely beneficial socio-political goal, rather than something that is focused on adhering to laws. There's an idea within disability justice that I oftentimes find myself returning to called access is love. It's an idea that 3 disabled Asian American women, Sandy Ho, Mia Mingus, and Alice Wong, theorized, and it is one of my favorite little ideas within disability justice. Mia Mingus has an essay that she adapted from her keynote speech at the 2018 Disability Intersectionality Summit that I will, of course, link down below, that is absolutely gorgeous, highly recommended reading, but here are 2 of my favorite quotes. Access for the sake of access or inclusion is not necessarily liberatory, but access done in the service of love, justice, connection, and community is liberatory and has the power to transform. I want us to think beyond knowing the right things to say and be able to truly engage. I want us to not only make sure that things are accessible, but also work to transform the conditions that created that inaccessibility in the first place. To not only meet the immediate needs of access, whether that is access to spaces or access to education and resources or access to dignity and agency, but also work to make sure that the inaccessibility doesn't happen again. And then later in the article, she also states, I would argue that disability justice is simply another term for love. And so is solidarity, access, intimacy. I would argue that our work for liberation is simply a practice of love, one of the deepest and most profound that there is. And that is where I will leave the idea of accessibility. But these three things, models of disability, interdependence, and accessibility, are far from the only main big ideas that exist within disability justice or become complicated by the framework of disability justice. We could talk about disability and queering the idea of time. We could talk about the complexities of ableist language and how it is so ingrained into the vocabulary of so many of us. We could talk about cure and treatment in a variety of nuanced ways. We could talk about how diagnoses are a product of colonial capitalism, and all of these things are ongoing conversations that I think we should all be participating in, that I simply don't have the time or energy to get to right now in this video. It's already pretty long. I'm sorry. And yes, I want you to think about interdependence and access, but I also want you to incorporate disability justice into every other aspect of your life because it is everywhere. But with those three big ideas out of the way, you may be asking, Ashton, what is the goal of all of this? What is the end goal? Where is this going? And that's a valid question, you know? What does disability justice want? What are we aiming for? What is this liberatory society that we dream of, right? And I talk about imagination as a revolutionary tool all the time. I think it's kind of similar to how Mariame Kaba talks about hope. If you're familiar, and if you're not familiar, I'll link stuff below, but the ability to imagine a world without oppression is something that an oppressive world wants us to lose. It is beneficial and it is profitable for the ruling wealthy for us to be entirely unable to imagine a better world. That is good for them. We can't build a better future without imagining one first. And I want to encourage you all, per usual, to imagine this with me. And my imagination is going to be imperfect, it's going to be incomplete, but that is okay because I think imagining a liberatory future is a necessarily collaborative process, and these are only some of my ideas off the top of my head. So, my imagined disability justice future is a solar punk commune. I want to live in a group of 10 to 20 little, well-insulated and sustainably crafted, accessible homes in a short distance from each other, completely powered by renewable energy. Most of the food we eat is going to be grown together and owned collectively. I want to live interdependently, giving what I can and taking what I need. I want everyone to rest when they need to. I want knowledge and resources to be shared and taken care of together. A disability justice future is also an abolitionist future. No cops, no prisons, no carceral or quasi-carceral systems of institutionalization, no Cop City, no Rikers Island, no Guantanamo Bay. A disability justice future is a future of bodily autonomy. It is a future of free, safe, equitable, and accessible reproductive healthcare. It is a future of gender-affirming healthcare. It is a future of fat liberation. It is a future of customizable accessibility aids for anyone that needs them or anyone that wants to try them out and see if they would be helpful. A disability justice future is a future of climate justice. It is a future of clean air and clean water, green spaces around every corner, massive systems of free, accessible, and green public transit, no Mountain Valley pipeline, no Cop City, no extraction, and no massive deforestation projects, and more indigenous stewardship over the land. A disability justice future is a land-back future. A disability justice future is a future of decriminalized sex work. A disability justice future is a future of border abolition. A disability justice future is a future of queer and trans liberation. And if you've got more to add to that little imagined future, those are some of my goals. What are yours? What is your disability justice future? Tell me, imagine it with me. And with that, my last section is about getting involved. If you are sold by all of this, if you're like, I think disability justice sounds up my alley, this is what my call to action is. This is what I want you to do next. First of all, if you have gotten to this point, I hope you already know this one, but listen to disabled people. This means not only following disabled people with the same disability or disabilities as you, follow multiply marginalized disabled people that are outspoken about it. I have some suggestions coming up a little bit later, but don't just rely on me for suggestions. You should actively be seeking out people that have different experiences from you, and you should be conscious about the types of people that you follow. For example, are you only following white disabled people? Are you only following disabled people whose caretakers or parents run their accounts? Are you only following able-bodied disabled people? Are you only following visibly disabled people? Are you only following conventionally attractive disabled people? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then you should try to rectify that. My next recommendation is to bring disability justice into your existing work. You don't necessarily have to start a whole new club for this. You can discuss and bring about disability justice in spaces that you already exist in. Cross-movement organizing is one of the core tenets of disability justice, and if we are just sectioning off disability advocacy to something that is completely independent and self-contained, that's not going to bring about the future that we want. Bringing DJ into your existing work also means thinking about it in your everyday life. Disability justice isn't something that disappears when it's inconvenient. You should reject ableism when you notice it and learn more about it so you don't just notice it when it's obvious. You should reject the eugenic logic that underscores so many aspects of our daily life. And what does that mean? I have a few suggestions. Number 1, wear a mask. Immunocompromised people, sick people, fat people, old people, high-risk people of all varieties, which, remember, not only includes a vast array of people with medical conditions, but disproportionately impacts people with disproportionately low access to healthcare, which, remember, is a category that disproportionately is made up of queer people, of trans people, of lower income people, which again is disproportionately a class made up of people of color, of incarcerated people, of sick and disabled people, of queer people, etc. If you believe that you are on the side of the oppressed, well, you are willfully ignoring the eugenic logic that underlies COVID minimization and leaving disabled people behind to die. You are not on the side of the oppressed. Wear a mask. Thank you. Another suggestion, if you make things on the internet, make them accessible as best you can. This means captions on your videos. This means alt text for your photos. This means minimal emojis or special Unicode text in your Twitter handle. Look up digital accessibility guidelines and figure out what you can do to make anything that you make online more accessible for more people, because why wouldn't you want your content to be as accessible as possible, you know? Another suggestion, if you manage, plan, or promote events, especially events targeted or marketed towards marginalized communities or events labeled as progressive, you should have those events in accessible spaces when at all possible and provide accessibility information without being asked with the event promotion. For example, is it wheelchair accessible? Are there accessible bathrooms? Are masks required? Are they provided? Are there going to be a lot of synthetic fragrances, etc.? Anything you can think of, and get input from as many disabled people as you can. Promote that with your event. That is really, really helpful for disabled people, and it is something that I would love to see more of. Another really wonderful thing that I've seen popping up more and more are mask blocks. It's a pretty quick Google search to find out if you have one local to you that you could join, donate to, volunteer with, whatever. And if you don't have a mask block close to you, you can do mask block activities on your own. What does that mean? That could mean putting up information or art in public, wheat pasting, stickers, whatever it may be, about COVID, about public health measures. You can carry around extra masks. You can donate masks to your local homeless shelters, churches, fucking community fridges, anything in your area where you can drop off a few masks that could be used by people who need them. That is a great thing to do. Talk to your friends and family about it. I would also definitely recommend looking into and getting involved with smaller, more localized movements. My knowledge of stuff like that is unfortunately pretty limited to my local vicinity, and obviously not all of these suggestions are going to be accessible to everyone. Not everyone can go do these things, and not everyone has stuff near them. Like, building online community, following disabled people like yourself and unlike yourself can also be really, really valuable in building connections with other disabled people, and also definitely something that I would recommend. Those are a few of my thoughts, but if you have additional thoughts, I would love to see discussion about that in the comments. And that is pretty much it. That's my spiel. My spiel? In addition to all of the sources that I've been talking about in the description, I'm also going to leave a list of book recommendations, a bunch of people that I'd recommend you follow if you want to see more about disability justice on whatever timeline of whatever social media that you frequent. So I would definitely recommend checking out all of those people and all of those books, as well as Sin's Invalid, obviously, if I didn't talk about them enough in this video. As always, I look forward to reading your comments on what a disability justice future looks like to you, and any ideas that you have for yourself or your peers or me for getting more involved in disability justice. I hope that this is an idea that resonates with you. I hope that you learned something. Goodbye, comrades. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that this wasn't too long. And I will talk to you later, maybe.